Cali, Colombia, December 20th, 1995. A Boeing 757 on a Christmas flight carrying 163 people into a mountain valley ringed by peaks above 13,000 feet. 159 dead, 4 survivors, 1 dog. In the final seconds, both pilots did everything their training told them to do. Maximum thrust, pull up, hold the pitch. They were fighting for every foot of altitude they could extract from the aircraft. They missed the ridgeline by a few dozen feet. The speed brakes were still deployed. Nobody had remembered them. Retracting them wasn't part of the procedure. If they had been retracted, the aircraft would almost certainly have cleared the mountain. Boeing had already identified a flaw in the 757's flight management system, a design issue that, under exactly the conditions of this flight, would delete critical waypoints from the navigation display and send the crew into a chain of errors they could never fully recover from. They had built the fix. They had applied it to newly manufactured 757s. It was never required on existing aircraft. This aircraft never received it. 2 known problems, 1 aircraft, a mountain in the dark. What does it cost when the fix already exists and nobody required it? A routine Christmas flight, delayed 2 hours by winter weather in Miami. A crew with no training deficiencies, flying into an airport the captain had visited 13 times. A descent that began normally, a clearance that was misheard, a navigation system that silently deleted the waypoints needed to catch the error, and a workload that climbed so fast neither pilot ever found solid ground again. The speed brakes, extended early in the descent and forgotten in the chaos, were dragging against every foot of the final climb. A few dozen feet. That was the margin. This is American Airlines Flight 965. December 20th, 1995 was a busy travel day at Miami International Airport. The holiday rush was already building. Passengers moving between gates, families loading overhead bins, the particular energy of a terminal full of people going home for Christmas. Most of the 155 passengers booked on American Airlines Flight 965 to Cali, Colombia, were Colombian Americans making exactly that journey. Some of the 6 flight attendants were too. The crew that assembled for the flight that afternoon carried credentials that would have been difficult to improve on. The captain was 57 years old, with more than 13,000 total flight hours, including 2,260 on the Boeing 757 and 767. Which share a common type rating. He was a decorated former Air Force pilot, a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for his service in Vietnam, who had been flying for American Airlines for 26 years. His colleagues described him as a very competent professional pilot and an excellent communicator. He had flown into Cali 13 times. His first officer was 39, with 5,800 total hours and 2,286 on the 757 and 767. Also a former Air Force pilot, he had served as a flight instructor and had been named Instructor of the Year in 1985. Neither pilot had any history of training deficiencies. Both had come through American Airlines training program, widely regarded as among the best in the industry, which incorporated the latest advances in crew resource management, human factors, and terrain awareness. All American Airlines pilots flying Latin American routes were required to complete additional training on the specific hazards of operating in that environment. Limited radar coverage, ATC language barriers, terrain far more extensive and severe than anything encountered in domestic U.S. operations. The captain was aware of all of it. He had been here before. The destination, Alfonso Bonilla Aragon International Airport, sits in a narrow north-south valley near Cali, surrounded by mountains on both sides. Some of those peaks exceed 13,000 feet. At the time of this flight, the airport's radar system had been destroyed by rebels in 1992 and never replaced, meaning the controllers in the tower had no way of seeing where arriving aircraft actually were. They depended entirely on pilot position reports to build their picture of the traffic. For this reason, arriving flights were required to follow published standard terminal arrival routes, STARS, that kept aircraft on predictable, terrain-safe paths and gave controllers the position information they needed. The flight plan for Flight 965 contained an explicit note: maintain strict adherence to the STAR. The Boeing 757 operating this service was in perfect technical condition. There were no defects logged. The weather along the route showed only light rain and scattered cloud near Cali, nothing significant. The dispatch paperwork was clean. What was not clean was the schedule. The original departure time of 4:40 p.m. had slipped, first by 30 minutes to accommodate passengers delayed by a 747 that had skidded off an icy runway at JFK earlier that day, and then by a further hour and 21 minutes of ground delays due to heavy outbound traffic at Miami. Flight 965 finally lifted off at 6:35 p.m., nearly 2 hours late. That delay had a consequence the crew was already aware of before they left the gate. With 2 hours lost, the flight attendants might not accumulate sufficient rest time before the scheduled outbound service the following morning. If the numbers didn't work, that outbound flight would have to be delayed, a significant operational problem that both pilots had noted and were quietly hoping to minimize. It was a background pressure, nothing urgent. Nothing that would register on any checklist or trigger any formal risk assessment, but it was there, shaping the lens through which a time-saving offer would later be evaluated. One of the 757 systems also carried something the crew did not know about. The flight management system, the FMS, on this particular aircraft had a known software behavior. When a pilot pressed the direct to button to navigate straight to a selected fix, the system would silently erase all intermediate waypoints from the navigation display. They would not appear as faded or ghosted. They would simply be gone. Boeing had identified this behavior. They had already modified the FMS logic on newly manufactured 757s to retain previously selected waypoints as reference points after a direct-to-input. That improvement had never been required on existing aircraft. It had never been retrofitted to this one. The crew had no reason to know this. It was not in any briefing, any NOTAM, any training module they had received. The aircraft looked and behaved like every other 757 they had flown. The flaw was invisible until the moment it mattered. To understand what happened on the descent into Cali, you need to understand three things: how the airspace worked, how the flight management system worked, and how the pressure of a compressed timeline can systematically degrade the quality of every decision a crew makes, even a very good crew. The airspace around Cali was non-radar. The controllers in the tower could not see the aircraft on any display. They knew where Flight 965 was only because the crew told them. This made the published arrival procedure, the Rosso 1 arrival, which routed aircraft from the Tuluá VOR northeast of the airport down through the Rosso NDB to the runway, not just a navigational convenience, but a safety architecture. As long as aircraft followed the star, the controller had a mental picture of where they were. If they departed from it, he was blind. The Boeing 757's FMS was the primary tool for navigating that procedure. Pilots could load waypoints, approaches, and entire arrival routes into the system, which would then guide the autopilot along the programmed path. The navigation display showed the aircraft's position, the programmed waypoints, and a magenta line connecting them. Under normal conditions, it was an elegant and reliable system. Under conditions of high workload and rapid change, it had a tendency to become a trap. At 9:31 p.m., with Flight 965 descending through the Bogotá sector and still more than 130 miles from Cali, the crew contacted Cali Approach Control. The controller's clearance was cleared to the Cali VOR, descend and maintain 15,000 feet, report Tuluá. What he meant was that they were clear to proceed through the full star. No traffic in the way. Report your position at Tuluá so I know where you are. The captain read back. Clear direct to Cali VOR. Report Tuluá. Altitude 15,000. The word direct had not been used. In U.S. domestic airspace, cleared to, a fix, routinely implied a direct routing, the most efficient path from present position to the fix. In non-radar airspace with high terrain and a controller who could not see the aircraft, it meant something fundamentally different. Proceed via the published procedure. The distinction was critical. The captain had flown this route 13 times and had received the Latin American operations training, but the brain fits incoming information into familiar patterns, and the pattern his training had most deeply encoded was U.S. domestic ATC. He heard what he expected to hear. He programmed direct to Cali VOR into the FMS. The system responded exactly as designed. Tuluá disappeared from the navigation display. Rosso disappeared. The intermediate fixes the controller was counting on to track the aircraft's position. Gone. Without warning. Without any indication that they had existed. This was the moment the Boeing fix would have mattered. On a modified 757, those waypoints would have remained visible, faded, ghosted, but present. The crew would have seen them. The controller had just asked them to report to Lua. They would have noticed the discrepancy immediately. The error would have been caught within seconds, before any of what followed had time to develop. On this aircraft, the display showed a clean magenta line straight to Cali, nothing to catch. 5 minutes later, at 9:36 p.m., the Cali approach controller offered a shortcut. The wind was calm. Would the crew accept runway 19 for a straight-in approach, rather than continuing to runway 01, which would require flying past the airport and turning back? Runway 19 was closer. It would save time. The captain asked his first officer. 4 seconds later, the decision made, they accepted. What they had agreed to, in those 4 seconds, was an approach they had not briefed, to a runway served by a non-precision procedure they had not reviewed, in non-radar airspace surrounded by mountains, while already high and close and fast, with the FMS loaded for the wrong approach, and the critical arrival waypoints no longer visible on any display. The workload required to set up this approach correctly, reviewing the chart, calculating step-down altitudes, programming the FMS, cross-checking every input, briefing the missed approach, was substantial under any conditions. Under these conditions, with the timeline already compressed and the terrain already close, it was beyond what 2 pilots could safely absorb. The pressure of the cabin crew rest problem had made the shortcut feel like a solution. The low workload of the preceding cruise phase had made the upcoming task feel manageable. The controller, who had no radar, could not have known that the offer was too late. As the crew began scrambling to reconfigure for runway 19, the first officer deployed the speed brakes to increase the descent rate. Nobody called the action. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody noted that the speed brakes were now extended. In an environment where the next several minutes would demand every unit of attention both pilots possessed, a significant drag device had been added to the aircraft configuration. Silently, without acknowledgement, without any mechanism to ensure it would be remembered. The Jeppesen navigation database carried its own quiet trap. The Rosso NDB near Cali had the identifier R in the approach charts. But in Colombia, 2 separate NDBs shared that identifier and broadcast on the same frequency. Jeppesen's database could not differentiate them using the standard single-letter scheme. Their workaround? Assign the full spelled-out name ROSO to the beacon near Cali and reserve the single-letter R for a different NDB. The Romeo beacon near Bogota, 132 nautical miles to the northeast. No pilot had received training on this edge case. It was an artifact of a database naming convention that the crew had no reason to know existed. When the captain typed R into his CDU to bring up the Rosso beacon, the system returned Romeo. He selected the first result, as he had done hundreds of times before, as the closest match was almost always the correct one, and pressed execute without cross-checking. The autopilot began a turn, not a gentle correction, a turn of more than 90 degrees to the left, away from Cali, away from the approach, toward the mountains northeast of the valley. Neither pilot noticed. The captain was tuning radio frequencies. The first officer was reading the approach chart. The aircraft was turning toward the Andes, and nobody was watching. In the cabin, 155 passengers were settling into their seats, looking at the lights below, thinking about the families waiting for them in Cali. Some of them were already asleep. 9:38 p.m. The first officer notices the turn. "Where are we going?" The captain tells him they are heading to Tuluá. The first officer asks again, "Where are we headed?" The question of a pilot who does not recognize the heading his aircraft is flying. The captain starts checking frequencies, cross-checking the FMS, trying to reconcile what he is seeing with where he believes they should be. Something is wrong, but neither pilot can name it. The aircraft has been turning east for several minutes. It is now heading almost directly toward the highest terrain northeast of Cali, the mountain range that separates the Cauca Valley from the eastern Andes. It is descending. The speed brakes are still deployed. The captain tries to re-enter Tuluá into the FMS. The first officer confirms the entry. It shows a left turn. The captain rejects this. In his mental model, Tuluá is still somewhere ahead of them to the northwest. A left turn makes no sense. He says, "Nah, hell no." What neither pilot understands is that they passed Tuluá several minutes ago. It is behind them. The left turn is correct. But the captain's mental picture, already fractured by the sequence of FMS inputs, the misheard clearance, the rapid approach reconfiguration, cannot accommodate this information. He is flying an aircraft he has mentally lost. The first officer is close to naming the real problem. He says, "Where are we going? Press on to where?" He can feel that something is fundamentally wrong, but he is on his first approach into Cali, in an environment he has never operated in before, and he has spent the last several minutes deferring to a captain with 13 Cali visits and a distinguished flying cross. The assertiveness that normally characterized his flying, the quality that had earned him Instructor of the Year, has been quietly eroded by dependence. Nobody says the words that would break the spell. Climb to the minimum sector altitude, stop the descent, figure out where we are from a position of safety. Instead, heads down in the CDU, still trying to solve the navigation problem with the tool that created it. At 9:40 p.m., the captain tells the controller they are 38 miles north of Cali. He sounds almost relaxed. He believes they are correcting the error, believes the worst is behind them. "We're in good shape," he tells his first officer, headed in the right direction. They are heading east at 9,000 feet, descending, toward mountains that top 13,000 feet. The speed brakes are still deployed. In the tower, the controller senses something is wrong. The crew reported 38 miles 2 minutes ago. How have they flown 2 full minutes without closing the distance? He does not have enough English to articulate what he suspects. He asks for their distance and altitude, hoping the numbers will tell him what the language cannot. He never gets the answer. At 9:41 p.m. and 15 seconds, the 757's ground proximity warning system detects excessive closure rate with terrain and begins its automated alert. Terrain, terrain, whoop whoop, pull up. This is not the enhanced GPWS with terrain look ahead that already existed as a prototype in 1995. That system would have given the crew more than 3 times this warning, enough time to recognize, reorient, and climb away cleanly. This is the older system, reactive rather than predictive, capable only of sensing that the mountain is rising toward them from below. It has detected the threat late. There is very little time. Both pilots react immediately. The first officer hauls back on the controls. The captain slams the throttles to maximum thrust. Nose up, full power, everything the aircraft has. The speed brakes are still deployed. Nobody reaches for them. Retracting the speed brakes is not in the terrain escape memory items. American Airlines has no policy requiring a hand to remain on the speed brake lever during use, the specific practice designed to prevent exactly this. The moment when the lever is forgotten because everything else has consumed every available unit of attention. In the noise and urgency of the GPWS alert, the crew is executing their training precisely. Their training does not include this. The 757 is climbing, nose high, stick shaker activating at the edge of the stall envelope. The maximum possible pitch the first officer can hold. The captain is calling encouragement. "Pull up, baby. Easy does it. More, more." The aircraft is fighting. It is not fighting as hard as it could. Near the village of El Diluvio, at the top of a fog-covered ridge in the Colombian Andes, American Airlines Flight 965 enters the trees at a steep nose-up angle, still climbing, still fighting, a few dozen feet below the summit. The debris field crosses the ridgeline. Both sides of the mountain receive wreckage. That is how close it was. 159 people die. 4 passengers survive, injured, in the wreckage. A dog in the cargo hold survives. Searchers reach the site the following morning, expecting nothing. They find a person standing in the debris, waving. The investigation was conducted by Colombian and U.S. authorities jointly, with the NTSB providing substantial technical assistance. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were both recovered and provided a detailed reconstruction of the final 22 minutes. The chain of errors was long and interlocked. The misheard clearance. The FMS direct to that deleted Tuluá and Rosso. The 4-second decision to accept runway 19. The Jeppesen database edge case that sent the autopilot toward Bogotá. The the fixation on the FMS that prevented either pilot from stepping back, climbing to a safe altitude, and reorienting, the speed brakes that stayed deployed through all of it. Investigators found that each individual error had been enabled or amplified by something that was either known or knowable before this flight. The FMS display behavior, silently deleting waypoints on Direct 2, had been identified by Boeing as a design issue. The modified logic that retained waypoints as reference markers after a direct-to-input had already been incorporated into newly manufactured 757s. It had never been required as a retrofit on existing aircraft. The aircraft flying as Flight 965 had not received it. Had it been installed, Tuluá and Rosso would have remained visible on the navigation display. The controller had asked the crew to report Tuluá. The missing waypoints would have been immediately visible. The misunderstanding would almost certainly have been caught within seconds of the direct-to-input, before the approach reconfiguration, before the database error, before the loss of situational awareness. The Jeppesen database naming conflict, two Colombian NDBs sharing the identifier R, was a known edge case in the database architecture. It had been addressed through a workaround that was invisible to pilots who had never been trained on it. No training material covered FMS database edge cases at this level of specificity. The crew had no reason to know that typing R would not return the beacon they needed. The speed brake gap was the most operationally direct finding. Retraction of the speed brakes was not a memory item in the terrain escape maneuver procedure. American Airlines had no policy requiring crew members to maintain physical contact with the speed brake lever during use. In the compressed, high workload environment of the final descent, the speed brakes had been deployed, forgotten, and never recovered. In the final climb, with both pilots executing their training correctly, the speed brakes were degrading climb performance by a margin that investigators calculated was almost exactly the difference between clearing the ridge and not. The GPWS had functioned as designed. Its design was the problem. The enhanced system, with forward-looking terrain awareness capable of detecting the threat more than a minute earlier, existed as a prototype in 1995 and had been under evaluation. It was not yet mandatory. Flight 965 would become one of the defining cases for its rapid mandating. In Cali, in Miami, in the cities where the passengers had started their journeys, families who had been expecting their relatives home for Christmas received the news instead. The Captain's Distinguished Flying Cross, the First Officer's Instructor of the Year Award, 26 years with American Airlines, 13 previous visits to this airport. None of it had been protection against the specific combination of failures that this night had assembled. 4 people walked out of the Andes, 159 did not. The changes that followed American Airlines 965 were swift by aviation standards. The Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, EGPWS, was mandated for all U.S. transport aircraft within 2 years. The technology that would have given this crew more than 3 times the warning time of the system they had was already proven. Flight 965 was the accident that made the gap between existing and required impossible to defend. Within a few years, EGPWS was required globally. Every commercial aircraft flying today carries it. The terrain awareness capability that was a prototype in December 1995 is now as standard as any instrument on the flight deck. Speed brake retraction was added to the terrain escape memory items. The procedural gap that had allowed a significant drag device to remain deployed through the final climb, unnoticed, uncorrected, was closed. In many airlines, the policy of maintaining physical contact with the speed brake lever during use was formalized, ensuring the lever could not be silently forgotten in a high workload environment. The FMS display behavior that had deleted Tuluá and Rosso was addressed through updated requirements for navigation system design. The principle that a direct-to-input should not silently erase waypoints a crew might be relying on was incorporated into certification standards. Boeing's existing fix, already applied to new production aircraft, was extended to existing fleets. Jeppesen revised its database documentation and training materials to address identifier conflicts. The gap between what the chart showed and what the database contained, invisible to any crew that had not been specifically briefed, was identified as a systemic training failure and addressed accordingly. The broader lessons were harder to codify, but no less significant. The automation dependency that had kept both pilots focused on the FMS while the aircraft turned toward terrain, trying to solve a navigation problem with the tool that created it, became a central case study in automation management training worldwide. The principle that reducing automation level is often the correct response when a situation is deteriorating, that aviate comes before navigate for a reason, was reinforced in CRM curricula across the industry. Two known problems had been on this aircraft before it left Miami: a flight management system that would silently delete waypoints under predictable conditions, and a procedural gap that would allow speed brakes to remain deployed during a terrain escape. Both had been identified. Both had partial solutions. Neither had been required on this aircraft. The fix existed. It just wasn't there. In aviation, that gap between known and fixed, between identified and required, is where accidents live. Flight 965 made that gap smaller in several specific ways. The cost of the lesson was 159 lives, and a flight full of people going home for Christmas. If you want to understand how the distance between knowing and requiring gets closed, and what it takes to close it, stay with this channel. The next one is already waiting.